By the summer of 1972, the civil rights movement had already made up its mind about Sammy Davis Jr. The marches and the millions he had raised for Martin Luther King didn't matter. The community he had served for a decade had decided he was a problem. On August 22nd, he handed them the photograph that proved it. He walked onto a stage at a Republican youth rally in Miami, saw Richard Nixon enter the room, and hugged him. The image went around the world within hours. Within days, Sammy Davis Jr. was the most famous sellout in American cultural history. But the hug wasn't the reason they pushed him out. The hug was the excuse. The real reason had been building for years. And to understand that, we need to go way back. The story starts in 1944, when Sammy Davis Jr. was drafted into the United States Army at the age of 18 and assigned to Fort Warren in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The Army had recently integrated its common facilities, which meant black and white soldiers now shared the same recreation rooms, transportation, and parts of the same barracks. What that meant for Davis was that the white soldiers in his unit beat him whenever they could find an excuse. He was a 5'4" tap dancer who weighed 120 pounds, and they came after him as a target. His nose was broken. He was jumped after performances, held down, and had racial slurs painted across his chest in white paint. He fought back, and the fighting made it worse. He was called every word the English language has for what he was. By men he was required to salute the next morning. His way out was the same one he had always used. He put on a show for the base, singing, dancing, doing impressions, and the men who had been beating him in the dark were laughing and applauding in the light. The beatings didn't stop entirely, but they slowed. Davis filed that lesson away. If you could make someone see you as a human being through performance, you could change that person. Maybe not permanently, maybe not completely, but enough to matter. He carried that belief out of Wyoming and never put it down again. It became the engine of everything he achieved, and eventually, the blind spot that cost him everything. He had been born in Harlem in 1925 to a pair of vaudeville performers and put on the road with the Will Maston Trio as a small child, tap dancing in segregated theaters across the country and sleeping on tour buses because the hotels wouldn't take him. By the time he reached Fort Warren, he had already spent 15 years getting strangers to forget, for the length of a performance, that they had any reason to dislike him. After the Army, the career picked up speed. He lost his left eye in a car crash in 1954, converted to Judaism during his recovery, and was back on stage within months. One eye, a new faith, and a body that still hadn't fully healed. He headlined in Las Vegas at hotels where he was allowed to perform every night but forbidden from staying as a guest. He would finish a show that brought the crowd to its feet, walk out through the service entrance, and sleep at a different hotel across town. He did this for years. He sang and danced and made white audiences love him in rooms that wouldn't give him a bed. Most people would have called it humiliation. Davis called it a foothold. From it, he built the most versatile entertainment career of his generation. Singer, dancer, actor, comedian, the kind of all-around performer who could do every part of a variety show by himself. By the late 1950s, the civil rights movement had begun to notice. The movement noticed because Davis gave it no choice. In January of 1961, he joined Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Harry Belafonte, Mahalia Jackson, and Tony Bennett at Carnegie Hall for a tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. The night raised over $50,000, most of it going directly to King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King wrote him a personal letter of thanks afterward, naming Davis alongside Belafonte and Sidney Poitier as artists who were not just identifying with the struggle, but actively participating in it. Davis later told Alex Haley in a Playboy interview that he would give Martin Luther King his good eye, and he meant it with the specific sincerity of a man who had already given things that cost him more than most people will ever be asked to give. Then came Selma. On the night of March 24th, 1965, the marchers reached the city of St. Jude on the outskirts of Montgomery for the final leg of the march to the Alabama capital. Harry Belafonte had organized a rally to lift their spirits, and the stage that night was built out of empty caskets, set on a rain-soaked field. Davis stood on it and sang the national anthem. This was a black man whose marriage to a white woman already required 24-hour armed guards at his home, standing on a stage in Alabama in 1965. In 1968, the NAACP awarded him the Spingarn Medal, the organization's highest honor. The record was unambiguous. Davis was a man spending his commercial value, his physical safety, and his public standing on something he believed in completely, which is what makes what happened next so hard to absorb, because it didn't come from his enemies. It came from the candidate he had helped elect. Davis had campaigned for John F. Kennedy in 20 cities across the country with Sinatra and the rest of the Rat Pack, performing, fundraising, and lending his audience to a campaign that needed black votes and Hollywood glamour in equal measure. Kennedy won, and Davis was invited to the inaugural gala. He had a special suit made. His wife, May Britt, a Swedish actress he had married in November of 1960, at a time when interracial marriage was illegal in 31 states, bought a Balenciaga dress for the occasion. They were proud, and they were ready. 3 days before the ceremony, the phone rang. Davis and his wife were no longer welcome at the inauguration. Kennedy's people explained that the president-elect was worried the sight of an interracial couple at his gala would anger Southern members of Congress, whose support he needed. The man whose election Davis had spent months working toward had done the political math, and Davis had come out on the wrong side of it. He had been useful during the campaign, and he had become a liability at the celebration. Dean Martin heard what had happened and made a quiet decision of his own. He told the Kennedy people he wouldn't be attending the inauguration either. He stayed home with Sammy that night, and the two of them watched football together while Frank Sinatra performed for the new president on the other side of the country. It was a small act of loyalty that nobody made a speech about, and it said more about both men than almost anything else in this story. 2 years later, in 1963, Davis and May Britt were invited to a White House reception for black leaders, and Kennedy spotted them standing near the press photographers. He turned to an aide and said it quietly but clearly, "Get them out of here." The community watching Davis had begun to keep score, and the ledger was no longer as clean as it had once been. The black press had been keeping its own ledger for years. The Amsterdam News and the Pittsburgh Courier had run editorials tracking what they saw as Davis's obligations to the black community, his interracial marriage, his conversion to Judaism, and most persistently, his role inside the Rat Pack as the group's perpetual punchline. Sinatra and Martin made casual racial jokes at Davis's expense on stage, and Davis laughed along with the room. From inside the relationship, the laughter was the price of admission to a world that would otherwise have shut him out. From outside, it read as something harder to defend. Then the movement itself changed the language. By the late 1960s, Black Power had reframed the terms of the fight. The new argument was that racism was structural, built into the institutions, the laws, and the economics of the country, and that no amount of performance or proximity was going to dismantle something that systemic. Historian Matthew Fry Jacobson, who studied this period at length, describes Davis as a genuine activist who simply could not make the ideological leap. He kept treating racism as a person-by-person problem at the exact moment the movement was insisting it had to be understood as something far larger. A new generation of activists had inherited a different fight, and Davis's old toolkit was not the one they had decided to use. By 1972, the two sides had been pulling apart for years. 6 months before the photograph that ended everything, his approach was still producing its sharpest results. On February 19, 1972, Davis appeared on an episode of All in the Family as himself. The show had spent 2 seasons making Carol O'Connor's Archie Bunker the most recognizable portrait of white American bigotry on television, a character drawn so precisely that audiences sometimes weren't sure whether they were supposed to laugh at him or recognize him. Davis walked into Archie's living room. They shared a scene, and at the end of it, Davis leaned over and planted a kiss on Archie Bunker's cheek. The studio audience laughed so hard and so long that producers had to cut footage from the final edit. It is still one of the longest sustained laughs in the history of American television. The moment worked because Davis was doing what he had always done, getting inside a white institution, performing his way through the door, and then using the room he had earned to expose the thing the room would rather not examine. He was making a white audience laugh at its own bigotry, in prime time, in front of 30 million people. The man who kissed Archie Bunker on the cheek knew exactly what he was doing. What happened 6 months later wasn't the act of a man who had lost his judgment. The problem was that he was about to apply it to a target it could not work on. In the months leading up to that night in Miami, Davis had accepted a position on Nixon's National Council on Economic Opportunity. He had lobbied the president directly on anti-poverty programs and civil rights funding, arguing in private White House meetings that Nixon should protect the very programs the movement cared most about. He was using his access as a lever he genuinely believed was moving something, working Nixon the way he had always worked rooms that didn't want him in them, betting one more time on the lesson Fort Warren had taught him 30 years before. When Nixon walked onto the stage in Miami in the middle of Davis's performance, Davis stopped. He introduced Nixon to the crowd as the president and the future president of the United States, and then he hugged him. The hug was impulsive and warm, the physical expression of a man who had spent months believing he was building a real working relationship with the person he was embracing. The cameras caught every frame of it, and within hours the photograph was everywhere. A decade of Selma and Carnegie Hall and SCLC fundraising vanished underneath a single image that told a story Davis had not intended to tell. The black community's reaction was immediate. Jet magazine ran the photo on the cover. The Amsterdam News ran editorials. Activists who had marched alongside him described feeling personally betrayed. Davis tried to explain the access, the lobbying, the belief that engagement from inside was a form of resistance. The explanation landed nowhere. In the era of Black Power, the photograph did not show a man working the system from the inside. It showed a man who had chosen the wrong side. The argument Davis made was coherent. The image was stronger than the argument. The deeper problem was that the argument was also wrong. The Nixon tapes, declassified in stages over the following decades, captured how Nixon and his inner circle actually spoke about Black Americans behind closed doors, in language that bore no resemblance to the warmth they showed Davis in person. The anti-poverty programs Davis had spent months lobbying to protect were cut anyway. The civil rights commitments Davis had personally pressed Nixon on went largely unfulfilled. Every quiet private meeting was rendered pointless by the gap between what Nixon said in those rooms and what he actually believed. Davis later said, in the years before his death, that he regretted the Nixon endorsement for the rest of his life. What is striking about those statements is their tone. No anger, none of the language of a man who feels he was bribed or coerced, only the quieter, more devastating register of a man who eventually understood he had been fooled. He had bet on his oldest belief one final time in the most powerful room in the country and discovered that the man on the other side of the table was immune to it. Nixon had wanted the photograph. Davis had wanted the policy. Only one of them got what he came for. Davis never fully recovered his standing with the movement. He spent the years after Miami trying to rebuild, publicly acknowledging he had been wrong about Nixon, returning to causes he had never actually stopped believing in. Some people came back. Most of the movement had already written its verdict and moved on. The photograph had done its work too completely to be undone by explanation or contrition. Underneath all of it was the financial reality of a career that had generated extraordinary money and held almost none of it. Davis earned an estimated $50 million across 6 decades. When he died on May 16, 1990, he owed the Internal Revenue Service approximately $7 million, a debt built up over years of mismanagement, extravagant spending, and a recording industry that had systematically underpaid him and denied him the rights to his own master recordings. He didn't own most of the music he had made. His widow, Altavis, who had co-signed his tax returns, spent years afterwards selling everything: the real estate, the memorabilia, even the Oscar statuettes he had collected as gifts across his career. The estate eventually lost the rights to his name and his image until a settlement was finally reached in 1997, 7 years after his death. On the night he died, the Las Vegas Strip dimmed its lights for 10 minutes. The city that had once made him sleep elsewhere because he was black went dark in his honor. He would have appreciated the gesture. He would also have understood, better than most, exactly how much and how little it meant. So what was the real reason Sammy Davis Jr. was pushed out of the civil rights movement? The easy answer is the hug, the moment a decade of sacrifice got overwritten by 30 seconds on a stage in Miami. That answer is not exactly wrong. The hug was the wound, and it never healed. But a wound that size doesn't open from a single photograph. It opens because the ground underneath had already been cracking for years. The real reason was a worldview. Davis had believed, from the day he walked out of those army barracks in Wyoming, that racism was something you fought by getting close enough to force the racist to see you. That belief was not naive. It had produced real results and changed real minds over 30 years. By the late 1960s, the movement had concluded that the problem was structural and that no amount of performance was going to dismantle something built into the country's architecture. Davis had concluded the opposite, and he was not going to change. The two positions couldn't coexist inside the same movement, and Davis ended up on the outside of it. What gets lost in the photograph is everything else. He marched at Selma. He raised millions for the SCLC. Martin Luther King wrote to thank him personally. He performed in Las Vegas hotels that wouldn't give him a room. He married a woman he loved in 31 states where that marriage was a crime, and hired armed guards to protect his family from the people who wanted to punish him for it. He was dropped from a president's inauguration, told to leave a White House reception, and watched the man he later endorsed mock the civil rights movement in private. Through all of it, he kept performing and kept fundraising because showing up was the only strategy he had ever known. Harry Belafonte said it plainly after Davis's death. His commitment, Belafonte said, was never really fully recognized historically. The movement he served pushed him out. History gave him back a photograph. He was a man of one era who kept fighting in another, and the gap finally became too wide for even his particular talent to bridge. If this story held you, you're in the right place. Off Script publishes new documentaries every week, the real stories behind the names you grew up watching. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment below. We'd love to know what you knew about Sammy Davis Jr. and what surprised you. We'll see you in the next one.